John. And thank you to the Apostolic Johannite Church and St. Sarah's Parish for hosting this event and welcoming me to speak today. I really appreciate it very much. There's a chair. So today I'm going to be speaking about the Cabala, originally a Jewish esoteric tradition, but that is no longer the case. So this is an interesting journey. Some of the conclusions or opinions I'm going to be discussing are not really mainstream, and the scholarship that allows us to do this research and form these opinions is relatively new, probably within the last 30 to 40 years. So again, my name's Greg Kaminsky, for those of you who don't know me. I'm a student of the Western esoteric traditions for about 10 years or so. I've been a Freemason since 2009. I'm a graduate student in medieval studies at Harvard University Extension School. And I'm the creator and host of the Occult of Personality podcast at occultofpersonality.net, which features a lot of interviews on these sort of subjects with esoteric experts and authors. So why am I talking about this today? I have a deep philosophical, spiritual, and academic interest in this subject, both for personal reasons and just because I find it really interesting. The research I'm going to be talking to you about today comes primarily from a thesis proposal that I wrote in 2015, which was not actually accepted, and it was really about the Cabala as a esoteric tradition that was really made up a good portion of the underpinnings of philosophical humanism, and we'll talk more about that. So I just want to give you kind of a roadmap, a little bit of where we're going to be going here, because we're going to jump around a little bit. So we're going to talk about the Cabala, what it is, and some of the key concepts to give you a little bit of an idea if you don't know already what it is. We'll talk about some historical figures who helped to move this tradition from Judaism into Christianity. And then we'll talk about that journey itself, how and why it happened, some of the key concepts. We're going to draw a link between Kabbalistic ideas and some of the ideas and practices of Freemasonry, and I'll explain why that's important. And finally, we're going to look at how these Kabbalistic concepts took on a different tone from Judaism into Christianity, specifically the idea of Messianism, or a Messiah who will redeem the world. Obviously in Judaism, the Messiah is yet to come. Christianity, Christ has already come. So that right there produced a significant distinction in the way that these philosophies manifested in the world. So when we talk about the term Cabala, it means reception, as in something being received, because it's a tradition that was originally oral, received, from mouth to ear. And the Cabala is just one historically particular example of religious esotericism. There are many examples in the world, and this is just one, a unique one at that, but it's just one example. So what is the Cabala? It's originally a Jewish esoteric tradition. It probably began sometime between the 1st and 4th centuries of the Common Era, but it didn't become publicly known about until the 12th century in Southern Europe. The Cabala is primarily concerned with the origins of the cosmos, the origins of humanity, and how these two things fit together. So Christian intellectuals became completely fascinated by this tradition because when they read the books and they learned about it, they saw ideas that reinforced aspects of the Christian faith. The idea of the Messiah, the idea of the Trinity, the idea of a feminine aspect of the divine, and there's many others. But when they looked at it, they kept saying, well, this reminds me of this, and this looks like this. So their general conclusion was, and we'll talk about this more specifically, but this Jewish esoteric tradition essentially reinforced their faith in Christianity. It sounds odd, and it is in a way, but we'll explore this in detail a little bit more. And so this Christianized Kabbalah was really blended with magic and alchemy and astrology to some extent. Because the idea was that because the Kabbalah was an original monotheistic esoteric tradition given to Moses by God, that all magical operations had to incorporate Kabbalistic ideas, divine names, Hebrew words, and philosophies in order to be successful. This was what would ensure your magic worked. Now, because the term Kabbalah is a Hebrew word, there are different distinct transliterated spellings that denote the specific type. So if you see Kabbalah with a K at the beginning, that's the Jewish Kabbalah. If you see it with a C, as I've been spelling it, that's the Christian Kabbalah. If you see it spelled with a Q, that's the Hermetic Kabbalah. It's typically concerned with the magical, alchemical, astrological operations. So this is probably the most succinct summary of what the Kabbalah actually is. So according to Kabbalistic tradition, the transcendent divine essence known as Ein Sof, or the endless, or without limit, or Ayin, which means no thing, created the cosmos through a process of emanation in which a series of 10 sephirot, or spheres, which he calls luminosities, mediate the continuum of being that connects the physical universe to God. According to this model, the sephirot, or these spheres, are described with strikingly paradoxical and apophatic language as the 10 that are simultaneously one and infinite. They channel the divine Shifa, or overflow, into the world, sustaining the fabric of being and bringing blessing to humanity. Now, due to the exile of the Jewish people from their land, as well as a history of Jewish violation of covenantal law, the interconnections between the Sephirot, according to the Kabbalists, are damaged, and the lowest Sephirah, Shekinah, or the divine feminine presence, accompanies the Israelites in their exile, sharing and embodying their longing for reintegration into the Godhead. The Kabbalists claim, however, that their esoteric teachings concerning this theosophy enable Jews to repair the damage to the Sephirot by means of performance of Jewish law and ritual, as well as the study of Jewish texts through Kabbalistic lens. In short, the Kabbalah is a claim to secret knowledge that presents a bold and forceful reformulation of Judaism as the mechanism whereby the very being of the cosmos is maintained. I know that's a lot to take in, but this is the underlying philosophy of what is going on here. So it's important to understand that the Kabbalah, even though the ideas that it espouses can be found at the very beginnings of the Jewish faith in the Torah, it was not formally put together as an esoteric system until much later. So the Torah, if we go by, religious, quote, history, unquote, was given to the Jewish people in exile from Egypt. So then the Jews establish their homeland, and then they go into exile, centuries later again. And then this tradition is developed, essentially. So you have a group of people, a religious faith tradition. These people are in basically continual exile. They may individually have some power, but as a group, their power is almost always less than whatever dominant group happens to exist where they live. So their esoteric tradition essentially reformulates how they see the universe and their place in it, because you're essentially, as a Jew at that place and time, disempowered. You have really no authority whatsoever. But with this system and the way they're imagining the universe functioning, the individual has supreme power and can throw the entire universe out of whack. So just to set some expectations as we talk about this subject, Kabbalah is ancient, it's very arcane, primarily an oral tradition, and requires initiation. It's mainly only accessible to religious Jews, not for any prejudicial reasons, but because you need to know Hebrew and you need to know the religious texts, the Torah and the Talmud, in order to understand what's being discussed. And it's a lifetime study, just like any religious or esoteric tradition. So I don't want to give anyone an impression that we're going to walk out of here in an hour and you're going to have any real understanding of the Kabbalah other than a very superficial one. But that's enough.
Message from down here. So listen, say, message.
Getting messages from beyond.
Yeah. So some of the key concepts I want to leave you with about the Kabbalah. So you have the three veils of creation. This was mentioned in the explanation earlier when he talked about Ein Sof, without limit, or Ayin, no thing. So you see here, these are the Hebrew terms for these three veils. We have Ayin, no thing, Ayin Sof, without limit or no limit, and Ayin Sof Ar, which is limitless light. So those are the sort of three thresholds, if you will, prior to the manifestation of physical creation. So once creation occurs, whether you view that as the Big Bang or the 6 days work or whatever it is, essentially you have an emanation from the Godhead down into the physical realm. And that's portrayed in what I would call a metaphorical, metaphysical diagram that's called Eitz Chaim, the tree of life. We'll look at that more. Now this tree of life, in addition to representing the cosmos, also represents the first human being or the first man, which is known as Adam Kadmon, the primordial man. Now this is different than Adam from Adam and Eve, although it could be the same person. But basically the idea is that this is Adam prior to any separation from the divine. So there's complete union with God, even though he's a physical being. And we also have the concept of the four-lettered name of God, the Tetragrammaton, Yud, He, Vav, He. We'll talk more about that. The Shekinah is the feminine aspect of the divine that falls into the physical realm and accompanies the Jewish people in exile. The Christian Kabbalists modified this four-lettered name of God to produce something representative of Christ, which they called the Pentagrammaton, Yod He Shin Vav He. That's essentially taking the Hebrew letter Shin, which is emblematic of the Holy Spirit, and inserting it directly in the center of the four-lettered name of God. Again, representing Christ. And obviously this is unique to the Christian Kabbalah. You have the idea of four worlds. And levels of consciousness kind of go along with this. So the Absolute is basically the realm of Ayin or Ein Sof. It's ineffable, essentially, and it sort of cascades down. And there's a concept also we need to talk about called gematria, which is essentially using the Hebrew letters and their numerical equivalents, so we can find out the values of words and phrases and compare those to equivalent values of words and phrases to determine relationships of things. And this is used extensively in the Kabbalah, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So here we have some images of the tree of life. I just want to give you an idea of how this diagram works, and this is an early instance of it. Essentially, we have a scheme where, the three veils are somewhere up here, and then we have these sephirot or spheres, starting with Keter or the crown, and it sort of cascades down into Malkuth, the kingdom. And you should understand that this is a dynamic model. It's not static. So you don't need to ask yourself which version of the tree is correct. They all are, depending on the circumstances or the time or place that they're being used. This is a tree of life from what's known as the Great Parchment. This was a Kabbalistic scroll that was handwritten several feet long. It's kept in the Vatican. And this would be someone's personal Kabbalistic, grimoire is not the right word, but it's kind of the equivalent. It's their one document that they would use for all of their esoteric study and practice, and that was it. That was all they had, and that was all they needed. Here's some different models of the tree. Again, they dated them, but these dates are not really, you couldn't say this model's older than this or this. They just appeared at different points in time. But you can see they all contain the 10 spheres, but the paths that connect them have been arranged differently. But the main thing to bear in mind is it's non-linear. So what happens is you have a hierarchical diagram here. So you have an ability to portray tensions of things that are not, polarized. It's not either or. You can have a whole hierarchy of meaning. Here is the Tree of Life diagram from the Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, and this is the primary model that we use in Western esotericism, this model with the spheres and the paths laid out as depicted here. This is a model from the Builders of the Adytum, where they've added the colors for the spheres, as well as the tarot keys that correspond to the Hebrew letters that denote each path between the spheres. Here's the Tree of Life diagram that's derived from another sacred geometry diagram known as the Flower of Life. And yet another depiction of it where you can see the idea of the two pillars, and it's kind of overlaid over a human figure. I know it's not that easy to see. But just bear in mind there's many different ways to portray this diagram, and it can be used to categorize many different things. Hierarchies of angels, alchemical metals, astrological planets, divine qualities, human qualities, on and on. There's nothing you can think of that you can't shoehorn into this diagram. So the primary modes of Kabbalistic practice, and we're still talking about the Jewish esoteric tradition here. So you have three primary modes of practice. Mystical, which is really religious, devotional, meditative, could be ecstatic at times. You have an intellectual mode of practice. Now this is really concerned with uncovering the hidden secrets of nature, whether it's in the world, in yourself, or in the holy text. And there'd be a variety of methods that people would use to go about this. Gematria, eschatology, speculating about the end of the world, alchemy, geometry, ciphers and codes, symbolism. And then you come to the practical work. This is theurgy, thaumaturgy, ceremonial magic, astrology, divination, any kind of folk magic. Generally, practitioners are engaged in one of these areas, but there's no rules to say that you couldn't be engaged in multiple areas simultaneously. Okay, here we go, talking about how this tradition transitioned from Judaism into Christianity. So in the late 15th century in Spain, you had the Spanish Inquisition going on. So Jews were being forced to convert to Catholicism or to flee, essentially. So you had people who converted, totally forthright. You had some people who converted but secretly maintained their Judaism. And then you had other people who just left. Well, there were so many Kabbalists in that area that many of them actually relocated to Italy. Similar climate, similar language, and these were very learned men, but they still needed to make a living, and they had no skills other than translating texts or teaching Hebrew and translating it into Latin or Spanish or Italian. So what happened is you had a lot of Hellenistic philosophies coming from Byzantium, the works of Plato, other Hellenistic philosophies like the Corpus Hermeticum. Now they were being translated by men in and around Florence, Italy. And at the same time, you had a lot of these Spanish Kabbalists in the same area working with these same Christian philosophers, teaching them about the Kabbalah. And these philosophers, immediately, as soon as they started hearing this, they're saying, we've got the Corpus Hermeticum and Plato over here, and we've got the Kabbalah over here, and in between we've got, Iamblichus, Plotinus, Porphyry, and, all the Neoplatonists. And they said, these things look remarkably similar. How is this possible? Well, the answer they came up with is not the one that we have today. The answer they came up with is that God gave Moses the Torah on Mount Sinai, and after he gave Moses the Torah, he gave Moses the Kabbalah, the secret oral tradition. That was accepted as fact, if you will, historical fact. So essentially the idea was that the Kabbalah from the Jews was the original esoteric tradition in the world and filtered down through Egypt, Persia, Greece, and the mystery schools into Neoplatonism. Now we know today that this is completely backwards. It's probably the other way around, that these more ancient mystery schools and Neoplatonism influenced the creation of the Kabbalah. But there are enough idiosyncrasies that I don't think this will ever fully be settled in a historical way, because, I mentioned gematria. So you have ideas in the Torah, which we know, far older than the public emergence of the Kabbalah. And so if we look at gematria, we see words in Genesis, Nachash, the serpent, and Moshiach, the Messiah. Both of those terms in Hebrew, gematria, equal 358. So we know that there's some relationship between the serpent and the Redeemer. What is that relationship? Regardless of what it is or isn't, that was there in the beginning. So when the Torah was composed, that was in it. So that leads to speculation that the Kabbalistic tradition was also in existence when this was composed. Otherwise, it seems too coincidental if we accept the idea that this document hasn't been altered since it was handed down. Now that's a big assumption, I admit, but that's where we're left with. So these Christian intellectuals, they believed that the Kabbalah was the original esoteric tradition in the world, and therefore it was more authentic, and because it verified, in their opinion, it verified the Christian faith, it was the penultimate esoteric tradition. Like, and when we get to talking about some of these people who looked at this, like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, he essentially stated that the only way to verify the veracity of the Christian faith was through the Kabbalah and natural magic. Now, those are huge statements in the end of the 1400s, and certainly the church condemned it, but the cat was already out of the bag. So let's talk about some of these Christians who were responsible for the spread of the Kabbalah. The first is a gentleman from Spain named Raymond Lull, or Lully, and he was fascinated with the idea of ciphers. And in his mind, he could take Kabbalistic techniques where they would sort of look for ciphered codes or information in the Torah, and he said, why can't I do this with English? Or why can't I come up with a device that will allow me to divine information? And so he came up with a series of cipher wheels, Lullian wheels they're called, and I think they use them primarily to try to divine information about oneself and how to apply sort of divine qualities in your daily life. But this was just an example of taking this esoteric speculation and sort of extending it. Here we have a picture of Marsilio Ficino. He was a Catholic priest. He was responsible for translating Plato and the Corpus Hermeticum. I don't know if he was the only translator, but one of the primary ones from Greek into Latin. And he was the head of an academy in Florence that taught philosophy, Kabbalah, Neoplatonism primarily, and he never had any trouble with the church. He was smart enough to understand how to advance his ideas without challenging the status quo too much. So if you're looking for a successful example of someone who is an esoteric forerunner, but is completely in accord with church doctrine, Ficino's your man. On the other hand, we have Count Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. He is not in accord with the church authorities. This individual, he's single-handedly most responsible for the adoption of the Kabbalah in a Christian milieu. I wouldn't be talking to you about this today if it weren't for Pico. He had an idea that in, I think it was 1486 or 1487, that he was going to draw up what he believed were the philosophy that would unite all knowledge. And he intended to present his theses, 900 of these theses, and debate them in the Vatican with the church fathers and any other religious authority who cared to participate, and would even pay their way to the Vatican to do so. Of course, the church, they read a lot of just very wild stuff, talking about magic, Kabbalah, ancient mystery schools, and how these all are valid forms of knowledge and support hidden truths of Christianity. So, of course, the church condemned these. They actually only condemned 13 of the theses originally, but that was enough to stop the whole thing. Later on, his oration was posthumously entitled The Oration on the Dignity of Man, and it's considered the foundational declaration of the Renaissance. It really was interpreted as the kickoff, if you will, of Renaissance humanism. However, if you actually read the oration a couple times, you will understand that his ideas about the human potential are just scratching the surface of what he's actually saying in this oration. What he's really discussing is the importance of learning and philosophy and using one's mind in order to ascend spiritually. And in doing so, he legitimizes the Kabbalah, magic, and all the ancient mysteries. And this is his preface to his 900 Theses. Now, this document went viral. In the Renaissance, it went viral, and it's been studied by scholars ever since then. But Pico's really single-handedly the person who brought Kabbalism into Christianity and therefore into Western esotericism. Johann Reuchlin, he learned Hebrew and the Kabbalah from Pico and Pico's teachers. He then went back to Germany, and he, again, almost single-handedly began a movement that came to be known as Christian Hebraism. Now, this is not the study of Kabbalah. This is Christians studying the Torah and the Jewish religion, basically, learning Hebrew. And this movement essentially grew out of Renaissance humanism because they were looking for authoritative, authentic religious texts that they could use that were not produced by Rome, essentially. Christian Hebraism was a huge movement in Europe, especially in Germany. There were instances where they would say, Reuchlin would give a lecture at the university, and there would be a line of hundreds of people out the door waiting to get in. So it's kind of remarkable to consider. And Reuchlin is actually responsible for saving the Torah and the Talmud in Germany. It's possible that without his efforts, those would have been lost at that time and place. So he did quite a bit, not just for the study of the Kabbalah, but also for the study of the Jewish religion outside of Judaism. Here we have Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Mettesheim. He wrote the 3 books of occult philosophy, the third of which is concerned with the Kabbalah. It's not often talked about, but decades after his book was published, he renounced his interest in magic completely. And much like Pico, he became much more conservative in his later years, although the cat's already out of the bag at that point. Here we have John Dee, the court astrologer to Queen Elizabeth I of England, and probably the smartest human being alive at that point in time. John Dee is important because he recognized, similar to Raymond Lully, that the Kabbalistic techniques were not limited to Hebrew. You could apply them to Latin, Greek, English, as well as to geometry. So his brilliant work was entitled Monis Hieroglyphica. And in that book, he essentially uses Kabbalistic techniques to derive the astrological planetary symbols and explains the geometry behind them and why they all make sense. So Dee's just brilliant for many other reasons as well, but his contribution to Kabbalism is huge and probably not as widely recognized as it should be. Giordano Bruno, another Italian scholar, promoted speculative Kabbalah, was burned at the stake in Rome for other ideas he had. Christian Noor von Rosenroth, he is responsible for the first translation of the Zohar, which is the Book of Splendor, one of the main Kabbalistic texts. And his translation was the first one printed. I mean, not the first one done, but the first printed one, and was thereby used by all the Christian Kabbalists and even by Mathers when he did his subsequent translation for the Golden Dawn. So some of the key translators and teachers, the number one is Flavius Mithridates Guglielmo Raimondo Moncada. He was a Spaniard living in Italy. He was Pico's primary translator and teacher, and we also had a gentleman named Johannan Aleman ben Isaac. Now these are interesting because these are Christian converts. It's speculated that they converted because, just like Pico, they found evidence of the faith, the Christian faith was true in Kabbalah. There's a lot of research into that whole area, and it seems like these conversions by Kabbalists were a lot less traumatic, because I think the way they viewed religion and spirituality was a lot different than the way most people do. And I would add that they were quick to introduce concepts and ideas into their teachings that allowed for these connections to be made. And Jewish Kabbalists don't always agree with these ideas. So why did Christians adapt the Jewish Kabbalah during a time of extreme religious intolerance, incorporated it into their own traditions? Well, I'd say that's actually not even an accurate description. What happened was really they appropriated it and made it the foundation of Western esotericism. Pico, in his oration, basically stated, the Kabbalah shows me the truth of Christianity, and if the Jews won't recognize it, they don't deserve it, and we'll just take it from them, and we'll use it as a weapon for conversion. And that's pretty much what happened. So what makes this system so special? Well, it's from a monotheistic religious faith. At that point in time, and you might argue even now, there is no other esoteric system that comes out of a monotheistic faith tradition. You could probably argue about that, but the other part is it's still alive, it's still living. There's still living people practicing it, writing about it, teaching it. It's not dead like the Egyptian mysteries, the Persian mysteries, the Greek mysteries. I mean, hundreds of years ago, those were put out of business. Again, they thought it predated all the ancient mysteries. We know that's not true now. And it's just because it was so accessible. So this living tradition was adaptable, reinforced the faith in Christianity, and importantly, it provides a shield behind which Christians can explore Neoplatonism, maybe even a little Gnosticism. Dangerous ideas, but behind the Kabbalah you can explore these things because the Kabbalah comes from Moses, so it's safe. So how do we account for it becoming the foundation of Western esotericism? Well, there's obviously these fortuitous circumstances. You have the Spanish Inquisition, exile of a lot of Kabbalists into an area where a lot of Christian philosophers are ready to receive this information. You have the idea of Jacob's ladder. This is the divinely inspired system that is sort of given to humanity to help raise itself up. You have this living extant esoteric system that's monotheistic. And I think under-recognized, but very important, is the Kabbalah promoted ideas that were at the time very progressive, very progressive. So some of these philosophies, what are they? One, humanity, in fact, individual humans are of primary importance in maintaining the harmony of the cosmos. This is pretty revolutionary in a time when the concept of individuality was not established yet. I mean, the idea that you could decide what you wanted to do with your life, that was totally unthought of at this point in time. It was just being born, that you were an individual and that you could make up your own mind about yourself and the world. So Kabbalism promotes this very thing. The idea of secrecy, it also promotes secrecy in general, but also this idea that secrets are hidden in nature and they are revealed to the wise. You also have the idea of correspondences between things in nature that would otherwise not normally be connected. Plants and body parts, or metals and planets. You have a concordance of religious philosophies. The idea of seeing that on certain levels things are in harmony. You have this idea of uncovering the secrets of nature, first through alchemy, and then as the scientific revolution progressed, you have chemistry and physics. You have the idea of sexual mysticism and a sacred feminine being introduced by the Kabbalah. It's not present in mainstream Judaism. Finally, you have this idea of Messianism, but again, once Kabbalah breaks out of Judaism, Messianism is transformed or transmuted into Utopianism, into the desire for social reform, and eventually into anti-monarchical revolutions. So Messianism, what are we talking about here? So there's a well-known scholar of the Kabbalah named Gershom Scholem. And he linked mysticism with Messianism, this desire or expectation for a human being who would come to redeem the world, to save humanity from itself, essentially. But so Scholem posited this direct connection between mysticism and Messianism. Now, he has historical examples to draw from. He's not just pulling this out of thin air. So, in the 17th century, there was a Jewish movement led by a man named Sabbatai Zvi. He was a Kabbalist, and he was interested in this, what was known as Lurianic theology. Isaac Luria developed an ecstatic devotional form of mystical Kabbalah that talked about devoting your life to what he called tikkun, mending the cosmic disharmony, or they call it returning the sparks to the divine. So essentially what this means is that it's not enough to just do a practice. You have to physically try to make yourself and the world a better place. So it's got wrapped up with Sabbatai Zvi thinking that he himself was the Messiah. And again, this is not uncommon in a Kabbalistic milieu to sort of transmute the idea of a Messiah from a sort of a redeemer figure out there somewhere to the redeemer figure who I need to become, to the redeemer figure who I am. So it's leaps and leaps, and eventually all of a sudden you're Christ. Is what's going on here.
We still see a lot of that today. You should see the emails we get from Jesus.
Yeah. Now I don't like to borrow material too much, but Ram Dass always uses this line where he says, if the problem is not when you think you're Christ, the problem is when you think you're Christ and nobody else is Christ. That's the problem. So this is the same type of deal. So Sabbatai Zvi, and there's another Kabbalist later on that the same type of thing happens. They get wrapped up in their practice, their movement develops, essentially goes to their head, and they think they're going to reform the world, and they say, come join with me, let's do this, I'm the Messiah. So you had a lot of Jews who sold all their worldly goods, joined up, and at the end of the road, Sabbatai Zvi was forced to convert by the Ottoman Sultan to Islam, and a lot of his followers did as well. And I think that was in Turkey at the time. And again, because he's a Kabbalist, he looks at it as, I'm basically taking off this coat and putting on that one. Whatever, I'll wear a different coat if you force me to. But in his mind, nothing changes. So that's Messianism. That's why Messianism can be dangerous. That's why mysticism and Messianism are looked at with a little bit askew, especially in Judaism. And that's why Kabbalism has a reputation that's a little bit colored. Now, as we see, promoting this idea of Messianism, working in the world to bring about reintegration with the divine, that's going to involve more than just, your personal religious beliefs. So we're going to look at political motivations for esotericism. So when you have an assertion of secrecy, that inherently is political, according to Dr. Hartley Lachter. And he claims, laying claim to restricted knowledge is a gesture of power. It's a power dynamic. So what you see here is Jews who are disempowered, creating an esoteric tradition that empowers them. They become individually responsible for cosmic harmony. They have knowledge of the creation and maintenance of the cosmos that nobody else knows. So it puts them, at least in their own minds, in a position way above the average person. So the Kabbalist choice to construct their esotericism this way reflects an engagement with the political and intellectual climate. And he talks about, during this period, Judaism was in an ideological or theological sense under attack from Aristotelian rationalism, from the scholastic friars, a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment, occasional outbursts of violence. So the Kabbalah was, in these scholars' mind, designed consciously as a defense mechanism against all of this stuff. Now, you could argue whether this was done consciously or not. The fact is, it is the way it is. And these power dynamics can't be removed from the Kabbalistic tradition. So what you're looking at is a disempowered group, the Jews, the Kabbalists, and they essentially create an esoteric theosophy that empowers them. Regardless if anybody else knows it or not, they're sitting they're in the catbird seat in the cosmos. So, Jews and Jewish religious practice maintains the cosmic order. So, in this sense, Jews are not just the chosen people because they accepted the law of God. This is the reason they're really the chosen people. They have a unique function in the world to sustain the being of the universe. So through the prayers and the practice of Jewish law, essentially maintaining the universe. So I don't know if this is as fascinating an idea to you all as it is to me, but I find this remarkable that a group of people who are under such threat, religiously, physically, culturally, their reaction is to create a system that essentially turns themselves or the universe, wherever you look at it, on its head. Everything's reversed. Now, Lochter says he emphasizes that this contextualization of Kabbalism does not really explain it away. He's kind of saying that these political ideas don't necessarily, it's not the whole picture. He thinks looking at it that way only is very reductionist. And I would agree with that. I think it's super reductionist. But it allows us an opening so we can kind of string together these things and see how Kabbalism ends up influencing, utopian ideas and political revolutions. So this is a quote from another author who was writing about Cabala, and he talks about what was needed was a philosophy that made a home out of exile. So he says Kabbalism is essentially like a medicine for people, who are in this situation, a balm to soothe them. And the Christians found it, and he says most notably Pico, and borrowed from it massively. And so what you have is what he's identified here is Kabbalah has this outsider quality. It's produced by a group of people who are the other in society. So it's ambivalent towards authority, towards tradition. Even though it's a tradition in and of itself, it has very ambivalent attitudes about tradition. Because, again, it's coming from people who are not the authorities themselves. So they're going to always challenge the existing order. So now some concurrent historical developments that were going on right at the same time. We've mentioned Renaissance humanism and Christian Hebraism. Don't forget the Protestant Reformation, huge. I mean, that's going on right at the same time as all of this. The scientific revolution, the idea of more individual liberty and responsibility coming out of humanism. And then we get into political reform and revolution. Specifically in these places, the United States, France, Romania, Turkey, and Mexico. But I think you could argue that the map of Europe underwent radical change over this time period, and some of it is as a result, an indirect result of these philosophies. One of which is Rosicrucianism. So, if you don't know, Rosicrucianism was a quasi-mythical movement that advocated for the universal reform of society, and it promoted the use of Kabbalism both speculatively and practically. So speculatively in terms of uncovering the secrets of nature, and practically in terms of alchemy, ceremonial magic, astrology, divination, etc. So the Rosicrucian movement, it's a presentation in and of itself, but suffice it to say it's not overtly political, but the indirect ramifications of the movement are inherently political. If you're familiar with the story of the Winter King, essentially the Rosicrucian sympathizers identified a monarch, or soon-to-be crowned monarch, in Bohemia. They rallied to his cause, and shortly after he was defeated in battle, and the whole thing went up in smoke. And it was the beginning of the 30 Years' War, which was a war of religion that destroyed Europe. And I would argue that Rosicrucianism wasn't a direct cause of this, but it was an indirect cause of this. And certainly the Winter King and this whole movement was directly connected with Rosicrucianism. So Freemasonry, we want to look at next. So Albert Pike, a prominent Mason in the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, in his book Morals and Dogma, describes how the tradition of Kabbalah has been preserved. And he says it's the same as the dogma of the Magi of Hermes, and it's contained in these books, the Sefer Yetzirah, the Zohar, and the Talmud. So he's basically telling you that the Kabbalah is the forerunner of Hermetics. This is the same idea that the Christian intellectuals had in the Renaissance. We know it's not accurate, but again, even as late as 1871, Albert Pike is promoting the same idea in Freemasonry. And it's accepted, I should add. It's not challenged at this point. We'll skip this. Suffice it to say, Pike, over and over again, describes Kabbalism as the original wisdom tradition of the world. He even has a lecture of the Kabbalists in one of the degrees, talking about number and the dignity of number and the certain values that go along with each number, referring, of course, to the numbers of the 10 spheres on the Tree of Life. So when we talk about influence in the Kabbalah, when I say influence, we're talking about the capacity to have an effect on the character, development, or behavior of someone or something. So we know Kabbalah can be traced to the 1st, 2nd century probably. Freemasonry, we can trace it back further than the 17th century, but it gets a little muddy prior to that. So we can say fairly certainly that it looks like Kabbalah is older than Freemasonry. We're pretty certain about that. So I'm not trying to tell you Freemasonry was directly started by Kabbalists or grew out of this Christian Kabbalist movement, but there are a number of similarities between Kabbalah and Freemasonry, and you could say maybe they come from the same esoteric current. The same people who developed Freemasonry were interested in the Kabbalah. And that's basically what it boils down to. They viewed the Kabbalah as the penultimate mythology, esoteric theosophy. I mean, it explained everything. They would reference back to the Kabbalah.